Greetings and welcome to this week's edition of Newsmakers TV, analysis and commentary from Santa Barbara's top journalists on the air since 2014 as Santa Barbara's most popular and provocative local news program. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Friday, June 16th, 2023, and I'm very pleased to welcome back my friends and colleagues, Nick Welsh, esteemed executive editor of the Santa Barbara Independent, who in real life is actually an angry poodle, and Josh Molina, political reporter, journalism educator, and Santa Barbara's own Joe Rogan, as host of the globally popular podcast, Santa Barbara Talks. Happy Friday, fellas. Hey, I was noodling around with arithmetic and calculated that between the three of us, we've been covering the news for something around 120 years, which I don't know. You could read that a couple of different ways. But anyway, we'll get the exact number next week.
I think the moral of that story is we need to get a life. But it looks like Josh has one.
Yeah, there is that. Okay, lots to talk about. More conflict at City Hall over the budget, new chapter for local emergency services providers, horrible spike in opioid deaths, and of course, housing. But I want to start with a couple of scoops, which you each published, somewhat related in the fossil fuel planet is burning space. Nick, this rather amazing story about a Santa Maria jury awarding a homeowner $63 million from Chevron. What's that all about?
Yeah, this is another one of those stories where you think, why isn't this story getting more attention? This is not a Santa Barbara jury. This is a Santa Maria jury, where oil is more part of the tradition. It's accepted. It provides grown-up jobs. They came in with a $63 million verdict. It was really Union Oil that did the damage. But Chevron bought them in 2005, so they're on the hook. But what happened was back, in the 60s and 70s, in this neighborhood in Santa Maria, before it was a neighborhood, they did all kinds of oil drilling and exploration and production, and they left behind a large, what they call a sump, filled with all kinds of toxic chemicals that are byproducts of the oil production process. Under state law at the time, what they were supposed to have done before, they were supposed to clear all that stuff out before capping it with a layer of soil. In this particular case, they either didn't know that they had to do it or they forgot to do it, but it was a big oops. 10 years later, in 1985, they sold this land to a guy named Kevin Wright, who is a consultant up in Santa Maria, and some of his consulting work was for the oil and gas industry. And this is Kevin Wright's dream house. And he builds this house with his wife and two kids right over this sump, which has all these toxic chemicals. Nobody tells him, guess what, dude? Benzene is kind of jumping out. And, many years later, he develops a blood cancer, a serious blood cancer that he is rendered, he supposedly has 2.5 years left to live. He is in remission, but he's getting regular chemotherapy treatment. His attorneys tell me, I've not spoken to him, his attorneys tell me that, he's sufficiently weak that he has to crawl up the stairs. They also told me, not in the trial, that his wife and two children also got cancer, but they got different forms of cancer. And that, the family, he and his wife divorced and the family sort of went into the winds. And so he's the only party to this action.
But the whole time, for 40 years, right? The oil company knew about this and did nothing, correct?
Well, that is what it comes out in the trial, is that for 41 years, they didn't do anything. Their claim was we didn't think we had to. We didn't know it, and this sort of was ignorance of the law is no excuse. What's interesting is that 41 million of the $63 million award was punitive damages. This was to send them a kick in the ass that they wouldn't forget. and you know, the argument made in closing arguments, Union Oil's attorney was making the case, you know, there is a spectrum of reprehensibility, and it starts with negligence on one side and it goes to intent on the other. And this was just negligence. We didn't know.
Just negligence.
And I mean, and the guy kept going, we did this over and over and over again, and we failed to act.
Yeah, I mean, it sounded like the defense attorney was making the case for the plaintiff.
I mean, when you read the closing argument transcript, you're just blown away. You're going, is this guy a mole for the plaintiff's attorney?
So they acknowledged it up front that they did it. It was
Yeah,
just
I mean,
our motive was not evil. Was their argument?
It was a little bit more contentious than that, but it does raise kind of the broader issue, which I really, to be honest, didn't have the time to get into, but it's clearly a follow-up. This was a big oil patch area, which has been converted to a lot of residential neighborhoods, and it begs the question, how many other properties did they forget to excavate the chemicals before they capped the land and sold it for real estate?
Yeah. All right. Josh, also in the speaking of fossil fuels, you got our old friend Elliot Jacobson, Dr. Elliot Jacobson, on your podcast this week. He, of course, is a member of the Newsmakers posse, a former cameraman of ours. But I mean, what was your headline? Doomer's earth-shattering chart on climate change. That's kind of.
And you know, that's the language he uses. He describes himself as a doomer.
Talk about who Elliot is and what he has to say.
So Elliot Jacobson is a retired mathematician and computer science professor at UCSB. He actually has a lot of titles, and he's a really eccentric, really smart individual. And what he does is he's a self-proclaimed doomer. So a doomer means there's no hope. So anybody watching, obviously, this is not me. This is what he's saying.
I've been telling you guys we're in a civilization extinction event, and nobody believed me. Now there's scientific evidence.
Yes, exactly. He says that there is no hope, there is no point, and he calls it the big green lie. And what his point is that, you know, he believes in climate change. He believes, obviously, the science is real. He's a scientist, but he says that humans are always thinking about how they can save the planet for humans, i.e. electric cars, solar panels, all of these technological devices that will make it easier for humans to live on the planet a couple of years longer. And he says that whole paradigm is wrong, that we should be looking at it from a planetary ecological system, because humans are doomed. And he predicts mass starvation, and it's going to start first in the parts of the country where it's the hottest, where it's hard to grow food, it's hard to get food. There's going to be a migration to the places where you can, and eventually it's going to be over. And his whole thing is he's a doomer, but he puts a spin on that says, I'm actually a realist. I'm actually somebody who does not have false hope. And he accuses some of these mainstream scientists, the kind who win awards, the kind who written about, the kind who are cover stories, who make the circuit talking as being practitioners of hopium. And what he means by that is that
did he talk about our very own Leah Stokes?
Yes,
he did mention her on the show, and you know, he did say that people who practice opium give people the false expectation that the planet can be saved, and that's a really bad way to look at it, because if the planet can be saved, then we're looking at people to save it, and he says it can't be saved. We need to instead be enjoying the moment, enjoying what we can right now, and acknowledge that we're part of the sixth extinction. He says,
and he's been quoted nationally and internationally, correct?
Yeah, and he says that if you drive an electric car, right, there's child mining of the lithium to support that. And so he's hard pressed to say you're a better person if you drive an electric car as opposed to anything else, because
don't tell Das. Oh man.
Because it's all very bad and hypocritical. So Elliot, right? He's this brilliant dude, and he has 34,000 followers on Twitter. So he looked at all the data, he put it in this chart, he tweeted it. It got like 2.7 million views. He's been in the LA Times. The LA Times, the day it came out, called him and did an interview with him and built a whole story about his chart, which showed rising ocean temperatures in the North Atlantic. It is the highest it's ever been. And he showed from 82 to 2022, and he showed all the blue lines and then this red vertical line that's higher than anything it's ever been. And the LA Times did a story on this. Forbes did a story. Last night, his chart and his name were on the PBS NewsHour.
Yeah.
This guy who walks around town and has a house in San Roque, who's this retired professor who
very low key kind of guy.
Yeah, and he's beat the casinos in Vegas and his own reputation along the lines there, is making international news. And he came on the podcast, and I don't like to stump on your show for my show, but please watch it. He is off the chart intriguing.
Well, let's face it, Josh, for you, it's just clickbait. How many? You're shattering all previous records for Santa Barbara Talks, correct?
Ed St. George has been knocked off as my most watched podcast. Of course, he made some choice words about Councilwoman Megan Harmon during the election, and referencing whether she should run for office or stay home.
Ed St. George, not Elliot Jacobson.
No, Ed St. George was now this one is going up there. It's almost at 1,600 views or something like that, which is a lot for a little old Santa Barbara.
But here,
you're our ranking expert, Nick. What do you think of Elliot's calculation?
well, I have no clue, but it is really interesting that here's this guy in his garage in San Roque who basically gets the data to wave the red flag in terms of ocean warming and planet warming. And for this particular day, now the rate of increase is going down since then, but we're still off the charts. I mean, he was telling me that there are places in India where when you factor the heat and humidity together, you have the effective temperature of 140, 145 degrees, which is borderline lethal for human habitation. We in Santa Barbara are whining and complaining about our protective doom. It was the May gray and the June gloom bubble. Elliot walks the walk. That's how he gets around. He walks. He doesn't have an electric car. He doesn't have an electric bike. He walks. But here's the thing you need to know about Elliot. He spells his name Eliot. Not your traditional spelling. And I asked him about that. He said, well, when my mom was in labor with me, she was reading T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland.
No.
So if you were born, if you're going through contractions and coming into the world as your mom is reading The Wasteland, it might color your worldview. I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm just saying I can't go there. His degree, the courage of his pessimism is boundless. And the thing that's hilarious about it is he's the most upbeat, engaged, lively human being.
That's the key. So when it's not going to happen say roughly the next 10 years, right?
I didn't ask him. And Josh, did you get a date when it's going to start?
Well, the experts disagree. Within 10 years, we are going to see some of these serious migrations that he sees because the temperatures are too hot and people can't farm and they can't have any sustainable food. And we're going to start to see that. 10 years for some, for those of us on the coast who have access to resources a little bit longer. But I just want to say one thing, because we know Elliot watches this show. Anyone who makes a judgment without watching the podcast should refrain from that, because he's really positive dude. He says he gives his life to service. He helps people. He's not somebody who says we should be depressed and down. He's saying we should be realistic. He says that he's actually a realist as opposed to somebody with hope who creates false expectations. He has realistic expectations. And so how does he live his life? Helping others, serving others, doing good for others. So that's sort of the message that he wants to send out.
All right, everybody really does want to check this out. If you care about the future of the planet, or if you want to give Josh a couple more clicks, it's SantaBarbaraTalks.com. Is that correct, Josh?
Yeah, and just YouTube it, Santa Barbara Talks, and it'll come up.
All right. A couple other things on the budget finally passed. What, $664 million, something like that. But conflict to the very end. Our friend, council member Oscar Gutierrez, felt that council this time shortchanged the cops, Josh.
Yeah, so Alejandra took about 8 minutes to lecture her colleagues for essentially not supporting law enforcement. And she said that if you're ever going to run and you're going to say you're here to protect public safety and the youth of our community, don't, because and not all of them, but just a few of them, you're not supporting the funding of these 2 police officers positions, a sergeant and a range master position.
I thought there were 4. I thought it was 4 positions altogether. I read in your story.
Yeah, 2 officers, a sergeant, and this range master position. And so she took the opportunity to do this in a big way at the very end. So it came across a little bit like, what is going on? Why didn't this come up earlier? She did bring it up earlier, but not in this scripted research sort of way. And the subtext of this, right? What nobody said this up there, but in talking to the other council members who opposed this, it's like we just came off the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter movement, and this defunding of the police conversation, and everyone agreed that that was the mood and what the populace wanted, at least the ones speaking out at the meetings. And then now here she is a couple years later, sort of saying, let's invest in them. And so some of those who weren't supportive of that were thinking, like, we're still looking at how to reimagine how we spend our money, and it not necessarily as officer positions. But Alejandra referenced the individual who died on the east side, she said, in public, near where she lives, and we all should care about that.
Shot and killed, right? Nick,
Yeah.
you wrote about that.
And we all should care about that. So she had a really compelling argument. She made a lot of sense. It was just sort of at the last minute. And at that time, Randy's ready to approve everything.
Yeah, although that's been Randy's position all along.
But this reminds me of when Dale Francisco was on the council, and there was always, the tug of war always is between public safety funding, which gets away about 55 to 60% of the budget, and everything else. And when Dale was there, you would see him laying the groundwork early on in the budget process, where he would try to figure out where he could carve out the extra money from other departments and figure out where the real shortcomings were in the police department. And he would do that consistently throughout the budget process. And I was wondering if that was a sort of do we see something like that in this case?
Yeah.
Well, there wasn't a lot of that. Kristen Sneddon sort of hijacked, maybe that's not the right word, but she set the tone for the conversations about transparency and overprojection of costs.
Right.
And then Alejandra was on her side, and she did mention it, just kind of sprinkled it at a couple of meetings, but it was never in this big dynamic way. Had she made this speech at the police budget hearing in this way, it might have been different. I don't know.
Yeah. Is she
what
going
was
to
the vote
re-election
on the budget? Was it 4-3, 5-2?
Well, you know how these things are, Nick. They're like super complicated.
Right.
So By the time they approved it, it was unanimous. It was
Right.
7-0. But they took these little straw votes ahead of time to determine what they could support and what they couldn't support. And so the stuff that could not be agreed upon, they just decided not to move forward with it. So it's kind of hard to even calculate that. I know that Kristen Sneddon was for the police funding. Alejandra was for the police funding. Randy was against it. Jordan was for the police
Randy
funding.
was against it, huh?
Yeah, Megan was against the police
Here
funding.
comes
so-
the email.
No, I wasn't. What are you
Well-
guys drinking over there?
But in the end, the vote was 7-0 for the budget, correct? So I guess you got to give the mayor credit for that.
Yeah, by the time they got to the end, they had already done everything the week prior and agreed on everything. So yeah,
Yeah,
it was
and for
just kind
those-
of a moment.
For those keeping track at home, that 665 million works out to $7,228.26 for each man, woman, and child in the city. So, I think I got my value out of that. All right, Nick, we've talked about this ambulance thing, the ambulance contract at the county a couple times. And I'm still confused because I thought until reading your piece this week that the whole deal was going to county fire, to the alliance of fire agencies, but not the case. They're cutting the pie 3 ways and everybody gets to bid on every piece. Is that right?
Yeah, it's under state law, if you award a ambulance contract exclusively, it's all or nothing to one company, the bidding regulations and requirements are extremely strict and limiting. And what happened was, when you looked at the bidding process here, AMR, which is the incumbent service provider who has been providing ambulance service for 25, 30 years here, won the bidding process. And there were some irregularities there, and there was an appeal, and the appeal lost. And then there was an appeal of the appeal, and that lost. And the Board of Supervisors were really frustrated, and the county administrators were really frustrated. They didn't have any faith in the process. And so the way that they got around it is they said, what we're going to do is we're going to award this contract in a non-exclusive manner. So we're going to open it up to anybody who could apply. So they broke it down into 3 component parts. One is your basic 9/11 service provider. That's one contract. The other is what they call inter-facility transfers. And that's, from hospital to hospital or nursing home to hospital. And then there's acute care where you need, some heavy duty
some medically
trained
trained
people. And they're all separate contracts. And anybody can apply for all 3. Or you can just apply for one. And the other thing that is different is that in the past, the decision was made by the county's emergency services department, and this time the decision will be made by the Board of Supervisors.
And as a practical matter, I care about this because it's going to get the ambulance to my house faster when
As a practical matter, what the fire guys have said, and they have said, we show up anyway to most of the calls for service, and we show up faster in most cases. And although AMR has done a good job, we can do a much better job. And we can get people
in terms of response time.
In terms of response time. And what we can do is we will not be cutting a big chunk off the top for profits. And we will be able to fold that back into operations.
Yeah.
So that was the big appeal.
Yeah.
The flip side is from the AMR is that's nice. Anybody can say anything, but you don't have a track record of doing it, and we do, and we actually have a pretty good track record. which is true. It's pretty good to better.
And do they have medically trained people for the third category that you mentioned, the acute?
You know what? I could say something, but I don't know what I'm talking about there.
Well, as someone who has personally researched every aspect of our healthcare system, I mean, the ambulance costs are just, I mean,
Off
it's
the
through
charts.
the roof. I mean, it's really something, and it doesn't get covered a lot. So, you know, the more they could do to bring that down in any way would be great. All right, Josh, housing, we mentioned. And you mentioned Ed St. George earlier. Finally, that project on Milpas Street, I guess, is signed off on and ready to go. And then you've been writing about this thing at the Jiffy Lube site as well, and it seems like everybody's in love with that one too.
Yeah, the Jiffy Lube site's an interesting one. Craig Minus is the developer, and he originally proposed something that they hated, the HLC hated. HLC member Keith Butler called it a monstrosity. It was 4 stories, were 22 units on kind of a rectangle there, and it was right up against the sidewalk, and they didn't like it. So they've been through a few iterations now, and it's scaled, it's stepped back, it's mostly 3 stories, it's 22 units, and 10% inclusionary. The challenge there is there's a Riviera Hotel across the street, which is a landmark. So they're upset about some issues there, but it is going to be a downtown housing project that is going to be.
It's on where? What's the location?
So it's on the corner of Carrillo and is that Delavina right there?
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. It's by Ralph's, right?
No, it's not by Ralph. Hold on one second.
Yeah, a little bit lower than that. And then Ed St. George's 82 unit project on Milpas Street was proposed or was approved. And the idea there is that's a big AUD project. It's pretty tall and it raised some concerns. He had a development agreement with the city to build one thing, and then he tweaked it a little bit. And that's what's been going through the design review boards. That's finally done. And he says he's going to maybe start building by next spring.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, I want to put something on your radar. We had a little op-ed this week in Newsmakers about it, and I was on a call last night about this group. It's called Our Neighborhood Voices, and it's totally grassroots, but the two instigators of it, a couple of council members from small communities up north, are trying to get an initiative qualified for the 2024 ballot to restore local control over planning and development issues that's been seized by the state because of the work of State Senator Scott, the aptly named Scott Wiener from San Francisco. And it's really important. I mean, they showed some of the projects that are being proposed under builder's remedy in communities around the state, and it's just breathtaking what they're trying to do. But I think the big argument is they acknowledge, yes, we have a housing crisis, but we have an affordable housing crisis, and the stuff that the state is doing isn't working. They're basically wieners in the pocket of developers, and as an example, they showed one single family house in a neighborhood, I think it was in Santa Monica, sold for $1.7 million. The buyer knocked it down. It was a developer, built 2 units on the same site, sold one for 1.8 million and the other for 2 million. So this whole idea of affordability is just kind of a crock. And that the state is holding hostage the housing element plans for communities until they can jam in. And again, they had 3 or 4 examples of different communities. So it's quite interesting. They only have a couple of weeks to get the title and summary of it to the AG's office. And then they have 180 days after that to gather signatures. So they're in a fundraising mode right now. But anyway, if anybody's interested in that, take a look at Mary Turley's op-ed in Newsmakers.
No, that's very interesting. To quote Dale Francisco again, he would say during budget crisis, or budget deliberation, he'd say there's nothing like a hanging to focus one's mind. And I kind of think that is applicable into the housing situation. And I do think that a lot of these local communities, while their outrage is legitimate, they also are at fault, and they have brought a lot of this on themselves because they haven't taken the housing issue seriously. And that nobody's really crafted a good counter argument yet. Like, okay, I mean, again, this is just me playing king for a day without a scepter. But if you were going to say, here's the mandates, you would say the housing bill would have to be like rental housing for the first, and you would have to have some sort of affordability caps, built in, so that here's what the rent cap is going to be over time, so that it's not like 5 years or 10 years or even 20 years. You'd have to have some long-term cap on the housing that was getting built under these density bonuses, that we were getting something in exchange. Instead, as you've mentioned, we have this sort of trickle-down economics that if we build a bunch, sooner or later the needle will move. And I think in places like Santa Barbara and coastal California, you could build everything you could possibly imagine, and it's not going to move the needle.
I mean, they literally showed a building that is going through the process in San Francisco right now under builder's remedy. It's on the west side, which is all, residential, single family, primarily housing, a couple of 2-story, 3-story things. That's 55 stories high. I mean, it's a gigantic thing being. And the other thing that I did not know is that Weiner has a bill going through right now, which may or may not make it out of the session, which would put another mandate on cities and counties. If you don't accomplish at least half of your arena numbers in 2 years, then builder's remedy applies to all the rest. So it's scary.
I think I like Buffy Wick's proposal better. She is a assembly member out of Berkeley, and I think she's trying to get something on the ballot, which would be a $10 billion housing bond, which would allow the state to build housing which is lowercase a affordable, and you would be getting these 10% or 15% inclusionary slices.
Yeah, I mean, that was another point they made, that there was a $5 billion housing bond like that passed both houses, and then Gavin wouldn't sign it for mysterious reasons having to do with contributions from developers. And, my opinion of Newsom is not high. I think he peaked out at his abilities when he was a parking commissioner appointed by Willie Brown. But be that as it may, the whole thing is just, there was a lot of information that I was unaware of. So I just recommend it to you. All right. Real quick, interesting. Both of you fellas interviewed Oscar Gutierrez this week. Oscar is having a moment. Josh, you had him on the podcast before. Elliot, what do you have to say that was of a breaking news category?
Well, Oscar, I ran into Oscar when I was doing the budget stuff, and we were talking about various things, and so I thought he'd be good to talk to. And so, he talked about what he is most focused on, which is youth after-school programs. He's interested in representing the West Side, and so he's like a hallmark example of what a district election candidate and council member should be. He very much deeply cares about the issues that affect the West Side and all throughout the city. So he has this micro focus. I was more interested in talking to him because when we talked a couple of years ago, he was having trouble getting his emails returned. The staff was not taking him seriously. He was feeling left out of meetings. And so I wanted to talk to him about that. And so he feels it's getting a little bit better now, but he did say something that I thought was kind of interesting. He said that he learned a lot from Kathy Murillo's mistakes. And I think what he meant was, he learned a lot from her, including his mistakes. But what he said was he was able to learn what not to do based off of that. And he is also learning from Randy, and the relationship's very different. He did indicate it's good to be on his own now because he was for a long time perceived as being Kathy Maria's puppet. She campaigned for him. She probably got him elected,
Sure.
and
Absolutely.
so not to undermine what he did on his own, but she was very formidable. And now she's gone and he's kind of on his own. So he has to develop a whole different kind of relationship with Randy Rouse. And I think Nick can go ahead and hear it. He talked about a whole bunch of other
Yeah, I
stuff
mean,
too.
you really do see a different kind of Oscar, I think, than you did the first couple of years. Nick, you had I mean, you talked to him a little bit about that, but also the parking wars that are breaking out on the west side.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes to a couple of things we've been talking about here. Housing. The West Side has always had some of the densest housing in the city. You have, and now you just have more of it, and it's. You have all these people who are cramming into apartments, and they all have to drive somewhere to go to work, and there's not enough parking provided, and people park on the street, and the warfare for street parking is getting a little bit intense. And he was talking about how
Why don't they? And what's the problem with residential permits?
well, that came up. So somebody said, well, what about residential permits? Well, then somebody else in the audience said, you know what, if you can't enforce the rules that we have now, what makes us think that residential permits are going to be any better? Going back to the police budget, typically they have 12 parking enforcement officers throughout the city. Now we have 4.
Wow.
And so you have one motorcycle cop who is out doing traffic patrol. So there's something to what Alejandro was talking about in terms of the police. There's certain functions that aren't about pulling people out of their cars and beating them up, but are like basic quality of life functions. They're having a hard time doing.
Yeah, and I mean, Oscar talked about one beef that there was some guy pulled a gun on another guy who was complaining about his parking spot.
I don't remember the gun part, but yeah, there was he was afraid, and Oscar said, "Well, I'll go talk to him." What you get when you talk to Oscar is a picture of somebody. Like, when the vendors came up, I mean, he claims he's gone up personally, talk to every vendor.
The illegal food vendors who are flocking here from LA, right?
Yeah.
Josh, did you write about the food vendors? Have you written that one?
I mean, I've written about it because it's been going through ordinance committee, and I think that the ones who come from LA, they're competition for the local people, and they don't follow the rules in terms of distance from businesses and where they can be. And so it's been a local issue for those who want to play by the rules versus those who are coming from out of the area. I think the parking thing is interesting because there's no place to park really anywhere in Santa Barbara, the west side, the east side. I mean, you can go up to San Roque, Samarkand, and there, it's not as dense, but it's hard to park. And it's one of the problems, and it goes back to the fact that we have so many families, multiple families living in homes. And so you can't, I mean, just because it's a single family home doesn't mean there's one family there. They all need cars. They all need to go to work. So they have families, they have kids. And I think it goes back to the bigger question of, as we're building these new housing units without any parking, you just wonder how is that gonna work?
By spiking the population by 10%.
Electric bikes, those little white electric bikes.
Oh,
well, Elliot says those electric bikes are bad, Nick.
I know.
Well, but the city put out this weird press release this week about how everybody should be nice about the bikes or something, or there's new guidelines. What was that about?
Well, what they did is they put up signs on State Street in the promenade, and they're fairly large, saying, warning bicycle riders that they need to yield to pedestrians, that they need to slow down. And it's, I think that the heat that everybody has been expressing about, oh my God, electric bikes and bikes on State Street is being heard. The cops do not want to have to enforce this for a host of reasons, one of which is lack of personnel. And so first you put up signs saying, hey, we're going to try to do this.
Yeah. All right. We got to get out of here. But since our theme has been the
doom and gloom,
living through a civilization extinction event with our good friend, our boomer doomer, Elliot Jacobson, Nick, real quick, the fentanyl opioid thing, which doesn't get a lot of coverage, is just kind of getting out of hand, huh?
Well, the story I wrote, again, this is sort of echo reporting. And by that, I mean, I did a story about fentanyl deaths a couple of weeks ago, and I put in a request for information, and it takes a while to get the information, and sometimes it's not available in time for my deadline. So this is some big information dump that I got after I'd already written the story, and it sort of filled in the picture of just the extent to which it's really taking off, and to which fentanyl, I mean, it used to be like 5 years ago, fentanyl accounted for maybe 13% of the opioid deaths. Now it's about 2/3 of the opioid deaths.
But the absolute number is also,
and the absolute numbers are going significantly up.
yeah. Okay. All right, Josh, this is the part of the program I usually ask you who's on the podcast, but you ought to keep that Elliott thing up there for 3-4 weeks at least, I would think. The way the traffic's probably, just doubled in the time we've been talking about it. So is that your plan, or are you gonna get somebody who will beat
Well, I usually, now that you mention it, I don't have anyone, I haven't set up the next one yet, so maybe I will keep Elliot there. But I mean, this, as we do these shows, and we want people to watch them, and a lot of people are watching this one, and Elliot is controversial. He talks about how he has to block 100 people on Twitter every day because people don't like his doomer perspective, and so most of the feedback I've gotten has been really good, but I'm sure there are some people out there who are going to be offended by his approach and his attitude. But he's smart. He's not a climate denier. He's somebody who says it's bad.
Not a
it's
crank.
Worse than you think.
He's not a crank at all.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
he's a serious scientist. All right, Nick, what do you got? You wrote half the paper this week. I lost track counting your bylines after you're a very prolific week. What you got anything coming next week we should know about?
Nothing I can talk about right now.
Oh, you hear that, Josh? You're screwed.
Oh man, well, I got one of those too, but I can't.
I mean, it was, it is weird that both of us had Oscar on at the same time, but I think it worked, and I thought Oscar's whole rap about why can't the school playgrounds and the school fields be better used by the community at large the way they used to when he was a kid. I understand there are issues, but they shouldn't be insurmountable, particularly in crowded districts like his.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's so much for this 120 years of journalism. Journalism tap dancing. Thanks to Josh Molina and Nick Welsh. Thank you all for watching. Thanks, Elliot, for your important work. And we will see you next time on Newsmakers.
All right.